We continue in our study in Matthew. I'll be wrapping it up pretty soon. But I've entitled the message today, Torment at the Tomb. Torment at the Tomb. And we're all familiar with the story. But I hope we can see a couple of things today that maybe we've not garnered before as we've studied this story. Beginning in verse 57 of chapter 27 of Matthew. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. Now that in and of itself is rare. Number one, he was one of the biggity-bigs in the temple. Number two, he was rich. So the fact that this rich man had become a disciple of Jesus speaks volumes in and of itself. He heard the word, he believed the word, and he secretly, for fear of getting excommunicated from the temple, secretly was a follower of Jesus. I guess we could say we probably have a lot of secret followers of Jesus, but to his credit, we're going to see his heart here in just a moment. Because this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. This was a bold move. This was a bold move. For him to go to Pilate, they had just put Jesus to death with two thieves on the cross. You might say for him to do that, he had to blow his cover. He was no longer a secret disciple when he went to Pilate to ask for that body. He had to come out in the open and everybody had to know he was a follower of Jesus. Most likely this was going to cost him his position in the temple. We don't know what else it may have cost him. But he was bold. He loved the Lord enough to make that sacrifice. He loved him enough to go ask for the body. So this was a bold move. Because if you look at it, where were all the disciples? Now, the best I can count, there were still 11 disciples out there. But when Jesus went to that cross, they just disappeared. They were scared. And yet Joseph of Arimathea was brave enough and bold enough to go to Pilate, who had just put Jesus to death, and ask for his body. Now, what in the world would lead Pilate to do that? Well, I think a couple of things. I believe that Pilate believed Jesus. He'd never seen anybody act like Jesus acted. When he was questioning him, he wouldn't even defend himself. When he asked him if he was the king of the Jews, he said, it's as you say. And I believe he watched how Jesus handled himself and how he handled himself on that cross. And I think there was some guilt there. Remember, his wife had come to him and said, this righteous man, the Lord told me in a dream, this is a righteous man. I believe between what he saw and what his wife told him that God had shown her in a dream, I think there was a lot of guilt involved. This was his way of sort of maybe trying to assuage that guilt a little bit by allowing Joseph of Arimathea to take the body and give it a proper burial, which we're going to see in a moment was totally against custom in that day. But he came forth, the disciples fled. Paul wrote about it in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16. Because look what the disciples, Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation. And to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. But what happened? The disciples were ashamed to be called disciples. But here was a Jewish leader who was ashamed of what he allowed to happen and he went and got the body of Jesus and asked if he could bury it. And then it says in verse 59, Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a linen cloth. Can you see him taking that body, wrapping it in a cloth, and carrying it in his arms to his tomb? Paul writes in Acts chapter 13, sort of alluding to what took place here without going into detail. But he said, when they had carried out all that was written concerning him, in other words, everything that was prophesied that was going to happen to Jesus had happened, just like the Bible says, and it always will. They took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. So he took him down from the cross, he wrapped him in the garments and the spices that they put the bodies in that day, and they still do to this day. And when somebody dies over in the Middle East, they have the funeral immediately. They don't embalm them and do the things that we do over here. They have the funeral immediately, right after the death. He took that body down. He wrapped it because, in his mind, he knew who this was. This was a holy body. And he gave it the respect that it deserved. Now, I've been to funerals and I've heard of funerals where people have lived some pretty rough lives and they weren't holy and didn't deserve the respect, but somebody tried to preach them into heaven. You've been to those? And, I heard of a woman whose husband died and the preacher was preaching, and he's talking about how this man was such a godly man, such a good man. He took care of his family. He worked hard, and he just went on and on and on. And the woman sitting there listening to all this, and everybody in the town knew that the guy was a deadbeat and never took care of his family. And finally she reached over and elbowed her son and said, "Son, what?" Mom said, "Go up there and look in that coffin and make sure that's your daddy." Because the guy that he was talking about wasn't the guy that she knew. In this situation, one who had been treated like a thief, one who had been crucified like a thief, and one who I'm going to get to here in a second, should have been buried like a thief, was given an honorable burial, just like the Old Testament said he would. He laid it in his own new tomb. This was the final honor that Joseph of Arimathea could give Jesus. See, rich people, most people, their graves were very common. The rich people could afford to have a grave dug out of the rock. And that's what this was. This was a tomb dug out of the rock. Very costly. This was his final respect, his final honor to Jesus Christ. He laid him in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15. Let me point one more thing out, then I'll point that out to you. As I mentioned just now, the common practice, if he was put on a cross with those two thieves, he was killed, he was executed like a thief, like a common criminal. The common practice was to take those criminals down and just throw them into a grave and just throw them all in together and just get rid of them. That was the common practice. But when Jesus came on the scene, God overruled their tradition. Isaiah chapter 53, he said his grave was assigned with wicked men, because there was two on each side of it, one on each side of it. Yet he was with a rich man in his death. Again, folks, this is something written 700 years before Jesus was even born. And now Isaiah is prophesying and telling how Jesus is going to be buried 700 years before he's even born. For people who can't accept the fact that this book is inspired by God, they're ignoring the proof. That was a pretty good guess by Isaiah, unless he was a prophet, that not only was Jesus going to die 700 years later, but he was going to be put in the tomb of a rich man. How did Isaiah know that 700 years in advance? But he did. Because he had done no violence. He was with a rich man in his death because he had done no violence. Nor was there any deceit in his mouth. What did Jesus say to them when they were accusing him of all these things? What did Jesus say? Which one of you will, in other words, which one of you would like to point out my sin? What have I done? Of course, nobody could, because he never sinned. He hung on a cross quietly. He died quietly, with dignity. He took one of the two thieves who repented. He took him with him to paradise. And then he died because he said it's finished. They let him down off the cross. Joseph around the field, rolled him up, wrapped him up in the linens and the spices, carried him to his tomb, and buried him in his tomb. Final proof that he was dead. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 55, Paul relates to this. And I love this verse. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? There was none. Not for our Jesus. It wasn't final. It wasn't a victory. The devil thought he had gained victory. He thought once he had Jesus killed on that cross, he thought it was over. He had won.
Yes.
What he didn't realize was he just put the final nail in his own coffin.
Yes.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. I would have loved to see Satan's face 3 days later when Jesus walked out of that tomb. Did you ever think about that? He thought he had him. He had him. He was dead. He was buried. Can you imagine? When you saw him get up and walk out of that tomb, can you imagine? You were dead. I had you. Oh, death, where's your victory? Oh, death, where's your sting? And folks, we got the same promise.
Yes.
If you're a child of God, you have the same victory. You have the same promise. If you are truly a child of God, if the rapture doesn't come first and we take our last breath here, the very next breath you take, you'll be standing in the presence of Jesus.
Hallelujah.
Oh, death, where is your victory? Jesus overcame death at the cross. It has no power anymore. Death has no power. Christians never die. You just change addresses and move up to a whole lot better neighborhood. That's all.
Amen.
As George Jefferson would have said, couldn't have said it any better. We're moving on up. We're moving on up.
Hallelujah.
Mary Magdalene was there. And the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave. Now, can you imagine those broken-hearted women sitting there, bawling their eyes out? Their master was gone. The one they loved was gone. Their hearts were broken. Now, the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. Now, here you've got two groups that couldn't stand each other. The chief priest and the Pharisees didn't like each other. But notice what happened. Even though they disliked each other so much, they disliked Jesus more. And because of that, they gathered together to see what they could do. Enemies working together. We still see that. One person will hate someone, someone will hate someone, but then the two of them hate the person so much that they can actually come together, and countries do this, come together for the common good because there's somebody that they fear or hate even more. the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. But notice what they said. And sir, we remember that when he was alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I am to rise again. Sir, they hated Pilate. They hated Pilate. But look at condescending. Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I'm to rise again. They understood what he was saying. They understood what he was saying. They knew he wasn't talking about tearing down the temple when they brought him in there to question him for that. They knew what he was talking about. He had told them that, go ahead and kill me, put me in the grave, but 3 days later I'm going to rise again. And they convinced the people to kill him. But now they're worried. And should be. You see, I don't think they ever doubted that he could rise again, because, think about this. It hadn't been that long since they watched Lazarus walk out of that tomb. Hadn't been that long. So if he could raise a man from the dead, which they knew was dead, they realized that there was nothing this man couldn't do. And they realized by putting him to death, as the chief Pharisee, Caiaphas, said, it's better for one man should die. But they realized, okay, right now they're okay. But 3 days later, Jesus comes out of that tomb, which he was going to. So they go to Pilate, who can't stand them and they can't stand him, and ask them, sir, this deceiver said after 3 days I'm going to rise again. They were telling the truth for a change. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he is risen from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first. Now let's just pick that apart a little bit. His disciples may come and steal him away. You mean those cowards that all ran away and hid and couldn't be found? Those disciples? Nobody knew where they were. They all ran off and hid in the upper room together, shuddering, afraid somebody was going to find them. But they're afraid that they're going to come and steal his body? Really? They may tell the people he's risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. Folks, everything we believe as Christians is wrapped around this fact. What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 17? If Christ had not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. Everything we believe as Christians is based around this one fact. He did rise from the dead. And if Jesus had not come up out of that tomb, if Jesus had not risen from the dead 3 days later, just like he said he was going to, Paul was right. You have no hope. For every sin you ever committed, you would have to give account for when you stood before God. How many sins does it take to keep you out of heaven? As we talked about in Sunday school, God's a holy God. That means there is no sin in heaven, which created a problem. God created us to spend eternity with him in heaven, There's no sin in heaven, and we're all sinners. Now that just creates a problem, doesn't it? Aren't you glad, not only did he create a problem, but aren't you glad that also he gave us a solution?
Yes, amen.
But he said, if they steal that body, then that last deception, see what they called it? A deception, will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, you have a guard, go make it as secure as you know how. Can you imagine how he probably said that? He didn't like these people to start with, and he knew that they had maneuvered him into doing their dirty work for him. And he didn't like them before that. Can you imagine how he said that? You have a guard. Go make it as secure as you can. In other words, you're scared of a dead man? Go put your own guards out there and guard it with ours. Make it as secure as you can. I don't care. I'll give you freeway. Go do what you want to do. I imagine if he had had his way, I imagine he thought more than once about taking a few of those leaders and putting them up there where he put Jesus. Go make it as secure as you know how. Ask yourself, do you think that centurion that we talked about last week, that saw Jesus up on that cross, and he saw how he died, and he heard him say, Father, forgive them. And then he made that statement, surely this was the Son of God. Do you think that centurion kept that to himself? Do you think Pilate may not have heard about what was happening at the cross and what was said at the cross? I have a feeling that Pilate was doing a little fear and trembling here too. He realized he had put a righteous man to death, and he may very well have been the Son of God. Now, did Pilate believe? I think he believed mentally. I don't think he ever got it down here, but I think he believed mentally. A lot of people do that. I think he was convicted. Remember how Felix and Agrippa, when Paul stood before Felix and Agrippa said, Paul, would you make a Christian out of me? And Paul said, what? He said, I would, sir, that all of you would be as I am, except for these chains. I think he believed like Agrippa did. Agrippa believed. He just wouldn't make the commitment. I believe Pilate believed, he just wouldn't make the commitment. We have a lot of that today. How about us? You believe? You believe everything I've said this morning is true. You believe everything you've heard about Jesus here is true. You might even be convicted and feel guilty about your sin, because that's a holy God and I'm a sinful person. But that's not the question. Pilate did that. Agrippa did that. Don't know about Felix. The question is not whether or not you believe it's true. The question is, have you ever committed your heart to Jesus Christ? You can be convicted and stay lost. You can believe every word in this Bible. You say you believe it's true, and you accept it intellectually, and mentally you believe it's true, and be lost unless you've made a commitment. Have you ever committed your life to Jesus Christ? Or have you believed Satan's lies? Oh, he's good at what he does. Let me tell you, you've heard these. If you become a Christian, you're going to have to give up too much. You're just going to have to give up too much. Let me just say this. Since I became a Christian, I've given up a whole lot of things. But I haven't given up one I'd like to have back. Oh, you're going to have to give up too much if you follow him. And you'll never have any fun. Heard that one? Christians are just old sticks in the mud. They don't have any fun. They don't enjoy themselves. Oh, we have a great time. I guarantee you I have as much fun as anybody else. And I don't have to drink or do drugs and all that to have it. I don't have to tell the dirty jokes. I don't have to listen to the dirty jokes. I don't have to watch that garbage on television or the movies. I don't have to do any of that to have fun. I can have fun. Folks, if God is living in you, the joy of Jesus Christ is living in you, and you can have fun. I have fun because I know whatever my days here are. When I take my last breath, I have fun because I know where I'm stepping. And I'm stepping off of this filthy earth, and I'm stepping on the streets of gold, folks.
Amen.
But Satan's a liar and a deceiver. Here's where he gets a lot of people. If we be honest about it. A lot of people sitting in the churches today. What separates them is the same thing that separated a rich young ruler. Have you heard this lie? If you tithe, you're just not going to have enough money to get by. What's that in your ear? If you tithe. I mean, it's a good thing to give a little bit. You know, you ought to give a little bit to the Lord. It's a good thing. But if you're serious about this and you tithe on everything you've got and you tithe, you don't have enough money to get by. Can I remind you, Satan's a liar? Our Jesus said, I'll provide all your needs according to his riches and glory. It's all his. And I don't know anybody, I defy anybody to show me somebody that tithes faithfully and they're not getting by because they're tithing faithfully. Now, your heart's got to be right. It's not a business deal with God. Lord, I'll give this, and this. If you'll do this, it doesn't work like that.
That's right.
But if your heart's right, an old Sunday school teacher told me when I was a teenager, and I never forgot it. I know exactly where I was sitting when he said it. He said, you cannot give God because you're dishing it out with a spoon and he's putting it back in with a shovel. And it's all his. But because of that, we give up. And you don't want to be able to do all the things you want to do. You can't play the lottery. You can't smoke cigarettes. You can't drink alcohol. You can't have any fun. He's a liar, a liar, a liar, a liar. Folks, when God gets your heart, you don't have to give any of that up. You want to give it up. You don't need it. Your trust is not what you can get. Your trust is what Jesus Christ said he would do for you. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. But we let the devil convince us. And we give up. Some people caught a large pike and they put him in an aquarium. And then they took some minnows. And he dumped all the minnows in there with him and he thought he'd gone to fish heaven. Man, that pike was just swimming around, just feasting. Then they took a glass tube and they set it down in the aquarium. And then they poured some minnows inside the glass tube. And the pike would go up and boom. He didn't see anything. They were right there, but boom. He couldn't get to them. And after bumping his nose and bumping his nose and bumping his nose a while, finally he just gave up and laid down on the bottom. They took the glass tube out. And the minnows could swim right around his head. And he wouldn't even try to, because he had convinced himself that he couldn't get them. The devil's put a lot of us in a glass tube. And he's convinced us of his lies. And we bought it. If I fully commit to Jesus, this is what's going to happen. They went and made a grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal over the stone. They secured the grave. They put a seal over the stone to hold it. And as that song said, all the power of heaven and earth and in hell could not hold Jesus in that tomb.
Amen.
Jesus had already said it, I'll be back. Oh, I'll be gone for a little while. But one day, I'm coming back. Which one do we believe? Do we believe what Jesus said? Or do we believe the lie of the devil? You know, hell's going to be full of some good people who believed a lie and gave up. Make it as secure as you can and set a seal on the stone. That stone didn't hold him in that tomb.
Glory.
That seal didn't hold him in that tomb. The thing that held Jesus in that tomb is the same thing that held him on that cross. How much he loves you and me. And it wouldn't make any difference what they put in front of that tomb or what they did. Jesus was going to be there for 3 days. His body was going to be there for 3 days. If they'd had the technology that they have today and have sealed that tomb, if they could have brought a whole mountain down on top of that tomb and covered it up, wouldn't have made a bit of difference. 3 days later, Jesus was going to walk out of that tomb. As the old saying, hell or high water wasn't going to stop him. They did all they could. But our Jesus said, I'll be back. Maybe you've been convicted, but have you ever committed? Do you know what it is to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ?